I want to welcome everybody who's joining us this afternoon in the middle of your very busy schedules to get caught up on what the issues and trends that have been uncovered through the Giving USA annual study have been over the last year. Before I introduce the panelists for today, my name is Ruth McCambridge. I'm the editor-in-chief of NPQ, at least for another few months. I'm transitioning out. And this particular session is one I look forward to every year. I think that through it, we end up gaining a lot of insights about what the trends are in fundraising. In a minute, we're going to go, as I said, to Dr. Patrick Rooney, who's the Executive Associate Dean for Academic Programs at Lilly School of Philanthropy at IUPUI, and Laura McDonald of Giving USA, she's the vice chair now, will soon be the chair, and the Benefactor Group. First, I want to remind you, before we go forward, I want to say before we do anything that we welcome questions. We're going to take questions from all of you, and because there's so many of you today, I'm going to pick and choose among them, really to reflect what people have already answered and also what the overwhelming kind of need is for the group to know a particular thing. So if you want to, at any time during the presentation, you can log in a question. I'll keep an eye out for whether or not it's already been answered, and we'll go from there. We're going to do that about the last 15 minutes. We're going to start with Patrick Rooney, who is going to present the findings, and then go to Laura McDonald, who has a great capacity to kind of translate this into practitioner terms in what do we do with this? You know, what does it mean for the way we fundraise? What changes might we need to make? But before we do that, I want to go to the next slide, which is NPQ's map of the nonprofit economy, the third edition. Because I want to remind people as we're going through this that in fact, what we're talking about today is one part of the revenue sources that flow into nonprofits. This map is an easy way to look at how much goes where, and it gives you a sense of kind of proportion, so that when we're looking at what our coming year may look like, we're going to be looking at the whole 9 yards of this, including our state and local government sources going to go down, our foundation funding going to go down, you know, what's going to happen around individual giving that I need to pay attention to. Foundations are, of course, a part of philanthropic giving, but federal government, state and local government, and fees for service are not. And so your budget is very likely made up of some combination of the above. So I just wanted to make sure that we kept a sense of proportion as we go into discussing this today. You, of course, know this as well as I do, so that was, you know, it was not a revelation to you. So I'm going to, at this point, just hand it over to Patrick, who actually, I don't know, I think this is your 5th year doing this with us, Patrick. We kind of do this.
Sometimes as you've passed.
Yeah. And Patrick is one of the researchers that works on the study every year, and he has an intimate knowledge, as does Laura, of the bits and pieces of this. So if you have clarifying questions that you want to ask, just, you know, toss them down on the question and answer board, and I'll pick them up as we go along, and we'll figure out where to insert them. But with that, I'd like to go to you, Patrick, to review what it is that we found out about last year's giving.
All right, thank you, Ruth. And so 2 things. I do have a suit coat here, and I was planning on wearing it since this is kind of a formal thing, But my office, the campus is officially closed, and my office is kind of like a room set up for hot yoga, and it is very warm, so I'm not, you'll just have to pardon me on that. And I have I was reminded, if I can put in a quick plug, that the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy is, given the COVID crisis and everything that's going on, we're offering tuition in the fall semester to any new or continuing undergraduate or graduate students at half off. So apply now, seats are open, and come one, come all. All right, unpaid ad, there you go, thanks Ruth. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Slide after that, slide, okay. So first I wanna say, so we've been working on Giving USA, doing the research, writing, and editing for the last 20 years. And it's been a fabulous partnership with Giving USA Foundation and the Giving Institute. But it's also important to acknowledge that Giving USA began in 1956. So this is by far the longest running data series about philanthropy in the United States. And it's the only data source that simultaneously measures all of the sources of philanthropy and all the uses of philanthropy. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the big news, the really big news, is that this year giving reached nearly $450 billion. And so to round to the nearest digit, it would be $450 billion. The other piece of this is that the last 3 years have been the highest 3 years ever recorded, even adjusting for inflation. So I think that, there's a lot of things that can be said that are good and bad about what's going on in the economy and good and bad about what's going on in philanthropy. But empirically, this is a very good year, and it's in a series of very good years. Okay, next slide, please. All right, I'm going to start with looking at the sources of philanthropy and talk about the rates of growth, and then talk about the market shares. And then we'll switch the uses and do the same kind of thing. All right, so giving by corporations grew the fastest of all the sources, over 13% in nominal dollars. Giving by individuals grew almost 5% in nominal dollars, and giving by foundations grew by 2.5%. Bequests was pretty flat in nominal dollars and negative in inflation-adjusted dollars. So one of the things we know about bequest giving is that it is the most volatile source of giving. That number can be a positive number, that rate of growth can be a positive number or a negative number, depending on who the wealthiest person who dies that year and how philanthropic they are. And it is always moved by the top 5 bequests, up or down. The giving by corporations is maybe a little surprising, but corporate profits have done well and the stock market has done well, so perhaps less surprising. All right, next slide, please. I just have this slide on here too to show the total giving. So total giving grew 4.2% this last year. The year before, remember, we had the tax change and individual giving declined and total giving declined slightly. So we saw some remnants of that. This year, perhaps, giving might have grown even faster if more people were itemizers like they had been before the tax changes. But that's hard to know precisely what size of an impact that had, if any. We estimated that the tax bill was likely to reduce household giving by about 4.5 points when it went into effect. And our results were pretty consistent with that. That's holding everything else constant. So the good news is total giving went up 4.2%. The bad news for philanthropy is it probably would have gone up more if more people were itemizers, or if we had a policy in place like the universal charitable tax deduction or universal tax credit. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Next slide, please. All right, some of the drivers of giving, personal income grew almost 4.5% in nominal dollars. GDP grew over 4%, and the S&P grew a whopping almost 30%. So the stock market, we know, is a huge driver of household giving. It's a huge driver of foundation grant making. It's a signal of wealth effects overall, and we know that wealth and income are the 2 biggest drivers of household giving. Next slide, please. This next slide shows the correlation graphically of total giving and the S&P 500. These are both indexed for inflation. but you see that the S&P 500 has a higher variance. It moves around more steeply and grows more steeply than total giving, and that's a good thing for philanthropy. But you can see that there's a pretty substantial relationship, even with perhaps a little bit of a lag. All right, next slide, please. I wanted to have this slide up here on individual giving or household giving, just because you can look at this over time and see that in the early 80s and mid 90s, the giving was growing about 1% per year adjusted for inflation. So relatively modest growth. We had the tech boom in the late 90s and giving really took off. Remarkably, that was sustained. So following 9/11, we had a mild recession and a dip in household giving, a pretty tremendous resurgence in that recovery. And then we had the Great Recession. And you can see very visibly how household giving plummeted during that period. I think it was 17% in the 2 years combined. And then we've had a pretty nice, but not necessarily smooth and continuous recovery in household giving since then, with the dip in 2018 for the tax, because of the tax effects. Again, we have another record in household giving, almost $310 billion. So we've seen pretty nice growth over the last 40 years, but it's come in different episodes. Different periods have had different rates of growth, different effects. Next slide, please. All right, so how is giving allocated? Right now, living individuals gave 69% of total giving. In their charitable bequest, they gave another 10%. Corporations gave 5%, and foundations gave 17%. One of the things that's important to note is that about half of foundation grant making is coming from family foundations. And so we see over time that there's been a shift from households giving out of their household checkbook to many more giving out of their family foundations. Now, it's less expensive and less costly to establish a donor advised fund or a DAF, and we may see a shift in that movement as well over time. Next slide, please. This slide shows the average market share in 5-year increments going back for the last 40 years. And one of the things that's really fascinating is if you look in the early 80s, household giving was 82%. Now it was 70% for the last 5 years. Foundation grant making was only 6% in the early 80s, and now it's 16%. That's a profound structural shift, and it's fueled by two things. It's putting new money into new family foundations, creating new family foundations, or adding to existing ones. There's also a portfolio effect. The stock market has done well over the last couple of decades. Over any long period of time, the stock market has grown 10 or 11%. So, you see kind of a portfolio effect as well. Bequest has had a modest increase in market share from 7% to 9%. Part of that is the transfer of wealth phenomenon that Paul Shervish and Don Havens wrote about a long time ago. And you can see that that's, we'll just predict that will go on as, the silent and great generation boomers transfer more and more of their wealth through bequests, both to their children and grandkids, but also to private philanthropy. Corporate giving, remarkably stagnant in terms of market share, steady at 5% year in and year out, with a little bit of rounding error perhaps, but that's, corporate giving has increased, but it just hasn't increased more rapidly than total giving, so it has not increased its market share over time. Next slide, please. All right, where did the giving go? Let's start out with, this kind of broad picture. So giving to religion takes 29% of the market share. We'll see in a few slides that 40 years ago, that was over half. And that was over half for a long time. So that's a, pardon the pun, a really remarkable secular trend. Okay, so there's my stats humor. From over 50% to 29%. As we've seen from the Pew Research and others, that far fewer people are attending mosque, synagogue, congregation. And what we know from our other research is that if you don't attend, you don't donate to religion. Actually, you see 1 or 2% of households who are non-intenders actually giving to a mass mosque, synagogue, congregation. I call that insurance. When you're an economist, you have to go for these subtle jokes, right? So going around the horn, education gets the second largest share, 14%, human services, 12%. Gifts to grant-making foundations is one of the largest pieces of the pie, and that's 12%. And going around the bend, public society benefit, 8%. Public society benefit, just to explain, includes things like donor advice funds and from Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab, things like that. But it also includes United Way Worldwide and the local affiliations, includes federated giving from things like the US government and the Jewish Federation. So it is kind of a hodgepodge of different entities. Some of those are increasing, some are decreasing, but overall, public society benefit has gained market share over time. Arts and culture at 5%. International, we started tracking that in 1987 as part of Giving USA. And so it was at 1% in 1987. Now it's at 6% of the total pie. So you can see that has grown very dramatically, both in real dollars and in market share. Environment and animals, similarly, we started tracking that at 1% in 1987. So it's tripled the market share. Gifts to individuals is large enough to note, but it's primarily free or heavily discounted gifts to individuals from pharmacy firms. That is, subsidized drugs, basic subsidized legal drugs to individuals. All right, next slide, please. One of the things, so this is a different view of the growth of the 9 subsectors. And one of the things we see is a very differential effect. So we have public society benefit, arts, culture, education growing in double-digit rates, environment and animals nearly double digits, health growing very robustly, human services growing very robustly, gifts to foundations not so much. And I will say that I was a little surprised by that personally because given the growth in the stock market, I expected that we might see a big bounce in gifts to foundations. I think that was perhaps dampened a little bit by concerns about whether or not that would be sustained, and people were kind of taking a pause to see. Religion is like the tortoise and the hare. In good years it grows slowly, and in bad years it grows a little bit more slowly, but it still usually grows. International affairs, as I said, has increased its market share from 1% in 1987 to 6% recently, and it's had several really strong years, and it went down last year primarily, I think, because there were not very many large national or international disasters that attracted a lot of new gifts. International affairs is probably the most volatile, or one of the most volatile, on the uses side of the scale. Next slide, please. So, as I just mentioned, several of the subsectors are growing at double digits in public society benefit. That is in part fueled by donor advice funds. We won't know the final details about donor advice funds for a couple of years, but it's safe to speculate that that's a part of what's going on there. Next slide, please. Oh, can you back up one second? All right, I'm sorry. So arts, culture, humanities, and education and environment, those subsectors are very pro-cyclical. That is, that they move in the same direction as the economy, but only more so. So if in a recession, those subsectors tend to plummet in very precise statistical terms, and in good years they tend to explode in a good sense. So we see this manifested itself very clearly here. All right, next slide, please. So this was looking at the change in market share on the uses side over the last 40 years in 5-year averages. And as I mentioned earlier, that the top part of this histogram is giving to religion. We see that for 15 years, it was over 50%. And if you went back another 20 years, it was still over 50% for those years. So we see a gradual decline, and it's down to 30% for the last 5 years. We see a rise in the share of education from 11% to 14%. And perhaps most meaningful, the growth in environment and international from basically zero in the early 1980s to 3% and 6% for the last several years, respectively, for environment and animals, and then international affairs. So some dramatic shifts in the market share of nonprofit giving. Next slide, please. I include this slide because, many of us have lived through this, these periods. This is total giving, and the mustard color bars on the histogram show officially declared recessions. And so we had a little bit of an anomaly in the early 1980s when we had a recession, but giving actually increased. But there was also substantial changes in the tax code and things like that were going on. Similarly, in the early 90s, we had a relatively mild brief recession, and giving went down, but not dramatically. Again, and following the attack on America, giving went down a little bit, total giving went down. And that was because, we had a relatively short recession that was induced by that. The Great Recession in 2007 is colored in as part of the Great Recession. Personally, I would not color that in as part of the Great Recession because the National Bureau of Economic Research said that the Great Recession started in December of 2007. I would argue with that empirically, but I would also argue about including that because it's just 1 month of that year. And as you can see, giving actually went up, but it went down over 15% in the next 2 years in 2008, 2009, during the real years of the Great Recession. Then we see a pretty steady and fairly robust growth since then, with the exception of 2018 with the change in the tax code. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to have a couple slides where we're going to talk about giving as a share of, and this is, and then to me, these reflect kind of our social values. So total giving as a percentage of GDP, 2.1% last year. And, if you read our press release carefully each year, we talk a little bit about why that may have gone up or gone down. But you have to say that, for the last, 20 years or so, it's been stuck at 2% plus or minus. And when we go into recession, it goes down a little bit. And it was stuck at about 1.5%, for a while, a long time before that. I've talked about before that if every household in the United States reallocated a daily trip to Starbucks to private philanthropy, household giving would grow dramatically. Household giving could double from very simple reallocations of our budgets. So these are, that's an empirical observation. These are the reflection of our values, our social values. So philanthropy is a core American value. More Americans donate than vote for president. That's important, an important manifestation of our civil society. At the same time, if we spent less on entertainment or less on dining out, things like that, could we drive up that share of total giving? Certainly. Next slide, please. This is reflected, similarly, but perhaps more dramatically, in individual giving as a share of disposable personal income. And disposable doesn't mean how much you have to spend after you pay all your bills. It means what are your after-tax dollars? So disposable in the sense of these are dollars that you have discretion of, because in theory, you can't give away your taxes because you're paying your taxes. So I'll let it go at that. Next slide. Corporate giving has been, popped up as a market share to 1% as a share of pre-tax corporate profits, and it has been averaging 0.9% for the last 40 years or so, and it's been around 0.8% for a few years. So it's nice to see an increase both in absolute terms, but also in relative terms, relative to its market share. I think one of the things going on there is corporations made a big point following the tax bill when their top marginal tax rate went from 35% to 21%. Many of them said that we're going to, rather than give this all to shareholders, we're going to give some to our workers and we're going to give some to charity. And we're seeing a manifestation of that here. Next slide, please. One of the things that I like about this slide is that it shows the relative growth and the number of nonprofit organizations. So we had a cleaning out period in the in 2011 to 2013, the IRS had sent lots of warnings to charities and said, look, if you are still in business, let us know. And if you're not, we're going to zero you out as a tax-exempt organization. So the number of charities dropped by a couple 100,000. But since that period, we've seen the number of charities grow by 5.2% per year on average for the last 5 years, for which we have data. If you compare that to household giving during the same period, grew by 2.4%. So you can see the number of charities is growing about twice as fast as household giving, which is in some ways great. On the other hand, it also suggests that charities are competing with more charities relative to the dollars that are going into the pot. So if you feel like you're competing with other charities, you are in fact competing with more charities than you were before. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my spiel, and I will turn it back to Ruth.
Well, I feel like I do a good job because essentially, Patrick, they asked me a lot of the same questions that I asked you before, and I asked Laura. So I'm going to just have you and Laura clarify a couple of points. People are interested, I think there's generally an interest in how the money flows from the various giving pots. And the first question is, do you think, and this was a question that we answered, do you think that some of the foundation giving may have been replaced by giving to DAFs? Donor advised funds, sorry.
Yeah, so I think that, one, that there's greater regulation of foundations, that there is an excise tax on foundations, and that and foundations are required by law to announce who they make grants to. These requirements don't exist for DAFs, and so I think some people are using DAFs instead of foundations, and some are using both for different reasons and different ways. I think the other piece of it is the transactions cost of setting up a foundation is much higher than for setting up a DAF, right? And so there are now some DAF funds that you can put in $500 and rock and roll with that, right? So you can't do that with a foundation, or it wouldn't be rational. So I think there are a lot of reasons why that might be going on, and I think empirically we're seeing some evidence of that, but it's one of those things that we won't know. We won't know what factors were which and when and why for many years to come.
I'm going to ask this next question of you, Laura, because we had a significant conversation about it when I was writing this report up, which is what's going on in the public society benefit area? And particularly, I mean, we have a big question here that's been repeated over and over. Can you tell us what's going to happen this year as the recession kicks in and our whole world is essentially in tumult? And I'm going to get back to that, that larger question later, but maybe you could get into that a little bit, Laura, in talking about just what is going on in public society benefit. And it's not just, it's comprised of donor advised funds and other intermediaries like the United Way, but it's also comprised of another significant cadre of groups. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So that's right. It's a little understood sector, even for those who happen to, their NTE code happens to reside in that sector. Because you're right, Ruth, on the one hand, you've got some of the aggregate funds, things like United Way, many of which rely on workplace giving, workplace campaigns. And we've seen that there's a pretty strong headwind for those organizations. And we've seen in some of the other studies that are cited that the fundraising for those organizations is in decline. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got the national, or sometimes called commercial donor advised funds. Donor advised funds at a community foundation are counted in the foundation bucket. So, but donor advised funds in the national, like Fidelity and Schwab and NPT, are in the this public society benefit sector. So, and we've seen that those are growing rapidly. On the other hand, you've got this middle ground of some advocacy organizations advocating for things like social justice, racial equity, voter rights, immigrant rights. Many of those reside somewhere in the middle. And while we don't have empirical data on those in particular, we can cite, and in fact, in this year's report, we will talk about several significant gifts that went to those advocacy organizations. And so, Patrick, I think you used the phrase hodgepodge. I would agree. It is a hodgepodge of organizations, but we've got these two forces, United Ways, Struggle, and other kind of United Jewish Appeal. Some of the workplace giving campaigns in many communities are struggling. The National Donor Advised Funds are soaring, and somewhere in the middle are these advocacy organizations. It will be fascinating to see the extent to which our current circumstances increase either the number of gifts and or the dollars raised by those organizations. And I think those are two different ways in which we'll measure their response to this time.
Right. Okay, Laura, I'm going to let you go quickly into your implications, but there are a lot of questions that have come in. So I'm going to let you go quickly into your implications, and I'm going to take them all at the end. So if people do have lingering questions, make sure and log them in now.
Great. So I think now you're seeing, and I just want to say this very quickly. Are you seeing the correct view, presenter view, or? Great. So we do an infographic every year that takes Giving USA and a number of other data sources and tries to boil it down into something that's easily consumable. And if folks want that, I think you'll probably share how they can access it after the fact. But I think that what's important is that we've got this bright, happy picture about what happened in 2019. And we know that a lot of the questions that people are asking today are about, how does that carry over into 2020? I think Patrick and Una Osili would tell us that, momentum doesn't really exist here. It's not like we carried momentum into 2020. But what are some of the things that organizations can do to try to be resilient through this time? And so we talk about a number of those. Don't presume to make decisions for your donors. Still have the conversation with them. Really focus on retention. We know that on average, only 20% of first-time donors are retained. If you could goose that by 5 percentage points, that could be worth $100,000 of revenue given the lifetime value of that donor. Really focus on relationships at this time. We've been fascinated in some of the work that being done by behavioral economists in this space, and I would say that there's a lot to learn there that could help you encourage donor behavior that maybe could get us past that 56% of households giving. We've seen some changes and this is cited in the Giving USA report, that actually people who include nonprofit organizations in their estate plans are younger and not as wealthy as we thought, so be talking to them. And we know that in the Great Recession, capital campaigns took a little longer, but still met their goals. So you might need to make some adjustments to your timeline, but in the Great Recession, they still met their goals. I also wanted to make sure that people knew that there are a variety of resources that are available from Giving USA as well. And if you use this discount code that you see on the slide, that will get you a 15% discount. There are also some free resources that are available there. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about the book itself and how to use Giving USA. So, it is a 400-page book. But there's a lot in it. And so I would encourage people to think about a couple of things. One, at the beginning of each chapter, there are some practitioner highlights, and then embedded in the chapters are also some good to knows. Those are helpful tips for practitioners. There's a lot of other good information that Patrick and his colleagues at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy put in here. But, I think that we use this, a lot of our clients, for benchmarking. This is what the pie looks like for sources of revenue. How does it compare to your pie? Could you be more resilient if you increased the contributed revenue from individual donors? Some things like that. So that's the book. Hopefully you will be able to avail yourself of this great resource and use it soon.
Okay, so here we go. We're going to free ourselves up a little bit, and I'm always trying to talk both Laura and Patrick into this, is don't just stick to the book. Let's talk about what's really going on here, some of which is contained in the book and some of which isn't. So this is implications time. And, you know, many of the questions, as I said, have to do that we are, you know, we have been in a tumultuous first half of the year, where we're in an election year, we've just been declared to be in a recession, like we didn't already know that, and we've just come out of a really unique situation with the pandemic, where many people were out of work and perhaps worried about their incomes. With all of that, when I talked to you, Patrick, I said, you know, what is this going to tell anybody, this 2019 report? Right. And you said, well, admittedly, it may be of less use than in other years, but, and so what is the but here? What do people need to pay attention to and track? Because I'm of the opinion that when things are moving this quickly, that an annual yearly report is of less use, and that you need to track on what's going on right now. So I'm going to ask both of you, what's the responsible fundraiser to do in terms of, you know, looking at what they need to know, when they need to know it, how often they may need to change up their strategy or check their strategy, all of that. Because I think that's what everybody's asking themselves.
Yeah, so Ruth, if I can just say, you know, a couple quick points, and then I'll turn back to Laura. You know, so empirically, I think, you know, there are a couple important things. So, you know, I will be the first to acknowledge that this is, you know, uncharted, unprecedented territory right now. And so, you know, our folks would kick me under the table and over the table if I started saying what's going to happen this year, because, you know, there's really no way of knowing very precisely at this point. But what we know from Giving USA is it's good to know, and it's very convenient that the COVID crisis didn't start until January in the United States. So empirically, for Giving USA 2020 about giving in 2019, it is in perfect isolation from the COVID crisis. There's no effects, you know, there's no tainted data, so to speak, in 2019 about giving in 2019. But we know from Giving USA historically, and this is one of the uses, how does giving change when there are natural disasters? How does giving change when there's a recession? How did giving change in the Great Recession? Well, so quick. Natural disasters do not reallocate, you know, they cause a brief uptick in giving to that disaster, and it doesn't usually cause a reallocation of giving to other things, right? So there's a slight short-term bump. Normally, though, disasters are regionally isolated, and so money comes in from other parts of the country, other parts of the world, to that regionally isolated area. And the COVID crisis case, the disaster is ubiquitous. It is everywhere, and everyone is affected or at risk for being affected, right? And so it's not like the Northeast can give to the Southwest or the Northwest can give to the Southeast. You know, we're all helping each other or we're not helping at all. Historically, during recessions, total giving fell by just over 3% adjusted for inflation. During non-recessionary years, giving on average for the last 40 or 50 years has grown just under 4%. So you see a 7-point swing in recessionary years and non-recessionary years. During the Great Recession, giving fell by over 7.5% per year. So you can see the economic forces are huge. What we don't know yet is we know we're in a recession, right? But this is unlike many other recessions. Many of you are working from home, still getting paid what you were being paid before. Many of you got a stimulus check. Many of you may have more cash in your checking account because you're not having transportation to work, you're not buying meals out, your dry cleaning went down, all these incidental aspects of working have gone down. So you may have more free cash flow than you did before. On the other hand, the person living next to you, they may be taking care of a sick person in their family, or they may have been sick themselves, or they may have been laid off, furloughed, what have you. Their income may have plummeted. And so we have a very disparate economy in terms of the impact of that. And therefore you would expect that will have a disparate effect on giving.
Let me go from that, Laura, and maybe you were going to address this, but I trust that you will remember what you were going to say and also what I'm going to ask you. One of the major issues right now, and I haunt Patrick about this every year, is how wealth inequality is affecting giving. And we want to go back to Patrick in a minute because he's done some major studies on that question, but I'd like for you to kind of weave that into your answer also, and also the question of, I call it proximate cause of the downturn, which is COVID, which hit Black and Brown communities particularly hard, widened the wealth gap in some pretty inconceivable ways, not inconceivable, unfortunately, predictable. And also at the same time, we have this much heightened activity consciousness growing about the role of race in actually creating the landscape of wealth inequality. So given all of that, which is a lot, can you take those things into consideration in your answers?
Yeah, and I think that you're right. Many of us are concerned about this and would like to see a move towards the redemocratization of philanthropy, that ordinary gifts from ordinary households. I know that the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy has stood up some web resources on just that topic. I'm sure Patrick will talk about the Generosity for Life project that they're working on. So the reality is that, at one point, this may or may not still be true, but 65% of all giving from individual donors came from 3% of American households, really showing that disparity. I think that there are two causes for that. One is certainly the wealth gap that you've talked about, and whether or not our human service organizations, et cetera, can address that in a meaningful way. And I will say that during the Great Recession, giving to human services never did decline. So That's one way that this can be helpful, is looking at, which of the sectors are pro, whatever that word was, fancy economist word Patrick used, but whichever ones are pro-cyclical, and then those that are counter-cyclical. So I think that would be helpful if you're trying to think about how to plan for your organization. Mm-hmm. But I think it also has to do with our behavior as fundraisers. Right? That, if you look at the most sophisticated fundraising shops, I'm thinking about sectors like higher education, large health systems, et cetera, they have major gift officers. And that's pretty much the top of the hierarchy professionally, that the major gift officers, that's the sort of career goal for many who go into the field. And they're given a portfolio of donors who have depending on the size of the organization, capacity to give maybe $10,000 a year or more, maybe $100,000 a year or more. Or maybe you're a leadership gift officer and you're just talking to people who can give $1 million a year or more, and showering them with attention. We're not doing the same thing to the donors of modest means. And in fact, absent using some of those cues that we're getting from the behavioral economists, we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot sometimes with the tactics that we use to attract, or more importantly, retain those donors. And so I will say the Fundraising Effectiveness Project data suggested that if we look 5 years ago, the nonprofits that participate in that study received 70% of their revenue from gifts of $1,000 and above. Last year, it was 85% of their revenue came from those larger gifts, but it did tick down this year. Right. Whether or not that's a hopeful sign or an anomaly, I guess we'll have to see. 1 year does not make a trend, but we'll have to take a look and see whether or not that continues. But I think we need to look in the mirror and say, do all gifts matter? Are we acting like all gifts matter? I think we can look at the cues from sectors like the women's funding movement, where they really do act like all gifts matter, and therefore, those donors tend to be more loyal to that cause.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so interesting because that you bring up the Women's Fund movement, because the assumption there is that you're not just giving, but you're engaged, that you're part of a movement. You're not just giving to somebody else who's going to do something. And I think that's an interesting distinction, and one that it gets lost, I think, in a lot of fundraising offices if they're separate from the organization overall. You did also, you know, when I interviewed you, Laura, you said something about particularly millennials and how millennials get involved in giving and what that includes in terms of a kind of almost a spiritual approach. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. And the Giving Institute is also working on an organization called the Generosity Commission that has commissioned some research on a variety of these topics. One of the things that I've observed, and I can cite a variety of sources for some of it, is that millennials define generosity differently than their parents' generation might have. That for them, generosity is not simply making a charitable gift, that there are a lot of actions that add up to that. And we've also, you know, we've taken the traditional time, talent, and treasure and added a fourth T, which is testimony. And that digital advocacy that millennials can often be very effective at. And yet, you know, sometimes we'll use terms like slacktivism to make it seem like it's not as valuable as the money that mom and dad gave. And so I think that, again, in some ways we harm ourselves. We also don't do a good job of counting some of the informal philanthropy that happens. Mm-hmm. Giving USA counts formal gifts to 501c3 organizations. But there's a lot of things that happen on GoFundMe or some of the other platforms that don't go through a nonprofit organization and therefore don't get included in what we count. Now, Patrick will probably tell you that it would amount to a rounding error if we did count it. But, you know, what's measured matters. Mm-hmm. And by not measuring it, are we conveying that it doesn't matter? And then finally, I think that if you want to engage a millennial, the last thing you should do is ask them for money. You better have authentic, not just made up dog and pony show, authentic ways for them to engage with your organization and make a meaningful difference before you start talking to them about making a charitable gift.
Great. Yeah. So Patrick, who we are always asking Patrick to answer questions for us. And about 2 years ago, I think it was that, we, you know, finally after me asking him year after year, what is this with you guys redefining the size of a mega gift every year? Because we were watching the category of mega gift go from 150 million to 100 million to 200 million to 300 million, I think within a 6-year period or something like that. And I was like, wait a second, you know, what is going on here? Are we just seeing a real, you know, just like this anti-democratic trend in giving? Can you explain what's going on? Because it didn't seem like the rate of growth and that growth of the large giver or the mega gift, but the large giver in general kind of made any sense together. Unless we were seeing a disappearance of smaller gifts. So I was wondering if you could talk about that trend, because it very much, I think, relates to what what Laura was just saying in terms of where we pay our attention, what we consider counts, and how we approach our fundraising and engagement. So I'm asking you to tell people what you found when you did that study.
Yeah, so a couple of things, Ruth. And so this year, to be labeled as a mega gift in Giving USA, and we can argue about whether or not this is the right definition of what a mega gift is, and I'm really not happy to have that argument because I think it's a very complicated, nuanced thing, and we don't have time for that in the remaining moments. But I will say, so perhaps arbitrarily, but we have labeled, and the reason the value has changed is we've labeled mega gifts as those gifts that are so large that they would account for 0.1% of total household giving in any given year. Okay, so in this year it'd be gifts of $300 million or more. So if household giving were, half as large, then it would be half as much to be a mega gift. We have argued as a team about whether or not mega gifts should be defined in a fixed dollar amount, like let's say $100 million or $1 billion or whatever it is. You could pick a number, but the reason we identify these gifts is we know that our models are very accurate in capturing rates of change over time, but that the timing of these mega gifts sometimes takes years, sometimes happens quickly, but that the timing of this is not going to be captured in an econometric statistical model. This last year, mega gifts, there were 4 collective mega gifts totaling $6.6 billion. That's about 1.5%.
Billion.
6.6 billion dollars. Right. So it's about 1.5%. It's under 1.5% of total giving. Now, one of the things I've written about and at your suggestion before is the concern over the decline of the median, the middle household group and lower income group households, that they are dropping out of philanthropy, at least formal philanthropy, entirely in many cases. And those who are giving are still giving generously, but many are opting not to give. And there are a lot of reasons why they may not. One of them might be the fact that they don't get a charitable tax deduction. They don't get a charitable tax credit. Now, I have to say, any gift involves an altruistic element, right? Because you are never better off financially by making a gift. If you only care about yourself, if you only care about your after-tax income, you would never give anything to anyone for any reason at any time, right? But taxes do matter as an incentive, right? They provide an incentive. They are a reflection of our social values. And that's why I've written pretty passionately in favor of having an uncapped, not an unhinged, an uncapped universal charitable deduction or a meaningful charitable tax credit, universal charitable tax credit, which would be preferable because with a tax credit that you get a share, the same dollar credit for, so let's say if it's a 25% tax credit, you donate $1,000, I donate $1,000, Laura donates $1,000, we might have very different incomes, and on a deductive basis, on a charitable deduction basis, the value of that deduction, charitable donation as a tax deduction, would vary based on our income and our top marginal tax rate. For a universal charitable tax credit, we would each get a $250 tax credit if we donated $1,000. So it's much more equitable and fair. And our research shows that adding a 25% universal charitable tax credit would increase household giving by over 10% and would increase the number of donors, net new donors, by over 12%. So these are policies that would democratize philanthropy, would increase total household giving, and would send a value in our tax policy that all gifts matter.
I want to touch on that study that you did on the dynamism in charitable giving. So while only 56% of American households may make a gift in any one year, if you widen that lens to as many as 8 years, I think you get to something like 87% of American households made a gift at some point in that period. And so that speaks to a couple of things. The fact that, as I said, only 20% of first-time donors make a second gift to that same organization. So focusing on donor retention and upping your game in stewardship. The other thing it says is that as fundraisers, we should perhaps put less emphasis on asking all of our donors to give more and instead emphasize asking them to give more often.
Right. Yeah, Laura, is a really important point. So I started working on a paper about 15 years ago, and the original title was called The Stability.
And like a true academic.
Yeah. So I may not be the solution. I may be the problem, but hopefully some of each, right? But what we had at that point was we had 3 or 4 waves of data of household giving, and what we saw was that year in and year out, that 60% of the households were giving and 40% were not, on average. And I was talking to Mark Wilhelm, who's another economist here, about this, and Now we have more waves of data. We have 8 waves of data over, a 16-year period of time. And what we see is that while each year it's, 60% give, 40% don't, but over those 8 waves, only 13% were hardcore non-donors who had never given. And they may have had very good reasons for not giving, right? I mean, not everyone can afford to. Philanthropy is a luxury good in many ways, right? If you can't feed your kids, you can't make charitable gifts. And so, on the other hand, there are many people who are donors every year, but there are a lot who are donors some years and non-donors other years. And so this artificial dichotomy, donors, non-donors, I think, one of the motivations for this universal charitable tax credit is to get people to think about it every year and to have our tax code reflect our values that all giving is good and that all donations from all income levels is good and should be rewarded in a similar manner.
I think what I want to do is to pick out a couple of points. And I know for people who have been asking very specific questions, some of the answers to them actually, because a lot of them actually are things that I brought up when I was doing the article earlier this week. I think we published it on Tuesday, so you can go back and look at that article. But I do want to I want to kind of sum up with 2 themes here, or 3 really. One is the cyclical, counter-cyclical theme. I think the idea that what's on people's minds is to some extent what gets attention from donors who may not be attached to giving a certain amount every year to people, which it appears there's a lot of. Is a very important point. People either are or aren't engaged. Right now, the issues that are front and center for a lot of people have to do with equity. And if you are working in that area, the importance of really engaging people in more substantive ways, including, in terms of their checkbooks, is critically important over this period. So we don't want to say to you, all you have to do is something mechanical, and no matter what you're working on, it's going to get attention. That's not the way it works.
Ruth, is that every organization should be working on that in some way. It's not like there's this little niche of organizations.
Right.
I don't care if you're an art museum or an animal shelter. You got to figure out a way to participate in this racial reckoning. And
in fact, there's a lot that's been written about arts and culture organizations regarding their participation or non-participation in equity issues. So I think that's proven itself out. It took the arts quite a while to climb back up out of where it was, and it's certainly not a perfect sector right now, but it's actually been attempting to address some of those equity issues very actively. The second issue I would say is that when Patrick's talking about the universal tax deduction, he's not talking in a vacuum in political terms. There's a bipartisan effort right now to pass that this year, and to pass it on a permanent basis and without a dollar cap. So for those of you that want to get involved in that, the National Council of Nonprofits, very actively involved. It's a good place to start. The second thing, the third thing I would like to say is that I think your point, Laura, that we make our reality as much as anything does. And we tend to think about, we need to look at all of these external effects on our ability to fundraise. And at least half of it has to do with you, and the way you're talking to donors, and what donors you're talking to, and how you on a larger basis look at engaging those constituents in common cause. So I think, it'll be interesting to see this year with so much going on, where does the money go, and who's giving what, and what are we seeing among all categories of donors at this point. Finally, I just want to say one last thing, which is, the wealth gap is undeniable. We have seen an extra close to $500 billion go into billionaires' pockets over the COVID crisis, which is an absolute, it's abhorrent. It's morally abhorrent. It should not be allowed. But it is where it is right now. If we can't address those underlying financial characteristics of this country, we're just going to see, a kind of a slide of circumstances that I don't think any one of us wants to see. So I'm just encouraging everybody to get involved also in larger economic issues. You hated that, didn't you, Patrick?
Well, so Ruth, one thing. So in an essay I wrote for you last year, I suggested that the capital gains tax should go away, and that capital gains should be indexed for inflation and taxed as ordinary income. That would help address part of the wealth issues, it would help fund the government, and it would provide a substantial stimulus to make donations of appreciated assets to charities, because then the marginal tax rate would be at nearly 40% as opposed to 10 or 20%. So, I don't have an answer for the wealth gap. I don't have an answer for some of the political science issues, but from an economic perspective, from a philanthropy perspective, that is a simple change that's not gotten much attention, that I think simpler to say than it is to do, but I think it would be an important step to make to address the wealth gap in a meaningful way, but also to increase total tax revenues and increase total philanthropic revenues.
Yeah. Laura, is there any final words that you have? And then I'm going to turn to Patrick, and then we're going to say goodbye for now.
No, I would just encourage all of our colleagues out in the field. I mean, I know that these are difficult and uncertain times. Again, we've heard from the economists that uncertainty actually has a negative impact on giving, on almost any financial model, economic model. And in some ways, I'd rather kind of know what the tail of the tape is going to be by the end of the year than be in this moment where we're still trying to make our way. But it is also, in my experience, a time of particular grace and generosity that people are giving to causes that move them. And, we should not presume to make the decision for the donors of what causes are relevant at this time in their life and what causes aren't. I think to have a meaningful, authentic conversation and to give them an opportunity to give. I'm not in the business of predictions, but I think that as we take a look at this year, we could see that, sometimes disruptions are a good thing, and we could see a really disrupted charitable giving economy disrupted in a good way.
Yeah. And Patrick?
Yeah, so Laura, I've said a lot of times that uncertainty is the enemy of investment in the corporate sector, and it is also the enemy of investment in the philanthropic sector. We don't like uncertainty in terms of our household decisions for a lot of reasons. That being said, and I still think that's true, that being said, sadly, this COVID crisis is causing us to reflect on healthcare. And what we've seen, with some of these tragic deaths lately, is thinking about, social justice for all people of all colors, all genders, and all sexual orientations in a way that we may not have since MLK. And so my Pollyanna hat is going to say that regardless of what happens to the exact amount donated this year and where it goes, this is forcing us as a society to address healthcare, to address social justice, to address racial injustices and racial inequalities and on all dimensions. And so I think that, you know, our report of Giving USA 2020, banner year in 2019, don't know what's going to happen this year, but I think this is an important year for our civil society, and it's an important year for our political society, and the economy is certainly an important piece of that, but it's not the only piece of it.
Yeah. So I'll close out with a sign that you see everywhere now, which is "You got this." And please stay in touch with us. Let us know what it is that you need to know about. If anybody is interested in writing for us, please, you know, give us a holler, and we will see you soon. Thank you so much, Laura and Patrick, and thank you for everybody who came.